afternoon. My name is Evie Sapphire Bernstein, and I'm the Program Director at Jewish Book Council. I'm so pleased to welcome you all to the second annual Global Jewish Literary Alliance event. This year, we're highlighting two incredible authors who've won awards from two of our partner organizations, the Wingate Prize and Jewish Book Council. These writers are Elizabeth McCrack, author of The Hero of This Book, and Sabrina Orah Mark, author of Happily, A Personal History with Fairy Tales. The conversation will be moderated by Josh Rolnick, fiction editor of Jewish Book Council's literary journal, Paper Brigade. The Global Jewish Literary Alliance is an international collaboration that aims to support a global ecosystem of Jewish arts and culture with a specific focus on the literary arts. We provide resources and community for Jewish writers and those writing books of Jewish interest. We also aim to ensure that readers are aware of these works and that Jewish communities and institutions have the resources they need to create meaningful programs and events about Jewish literature. The members of the Global Jewish Literary Alliance are the Wingate Prize, Jewish Book Council, JCC Association of North America, JW3, and the Jewish Literary Foundation. We are happy and proud to be a part of this wonderful organization and work together with these wonderful institutions. I want to especially thank Juliet Simmons and Randy Luderman for their help in putting this event together. The power of a global Jewish literary community, especially in this moment, cannot be overstated, and I'm so glad we are able to celebrate these two incredible authors. We are proud to celebrate and uplift Jewish authors, books, and narratives from across the globe, and we are so thankful you are all here to join us. And with that, I'll toss it over to Josh. Josh Rolnick's short story collection, Pulp and Paper, won the John Simmons Short Fiction Award. His short stories have also won the Arts and Letters Fiction Prize and the Florida Review Editor's Choice Prize. He's a faculty lecturer at the Johns Hopkins MA in Writing program and the fiction editor of Paper Brigade, the literary annual of Jewish Book Council. Josh, take it away.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Elizabeth and Sabrina, for being with us today. It's so great to be in conversation with you. I think we'll start with just a little bit of bios to let everybody know who you are. We have with us today Elizabeth McCrack, who is the author of 8 books, including Here's Your Hat, What's Your Hurry, The Giant's House, and the book we'll be speaking about today, The Hero of This Book. Elizabeth has received grants and fellowships from the Guggen Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the American Academy in Berlin, among others. Thunderstruck and Other Stories won the 2015 Story Prize, and her work has been published in the Best American Short Stories, the Pushcart Prize, the O. Henry Prize, the New York Times Magazine, and many, many other places. Elizabeth teaches at the University of Texas at Austin and in the low residency MFA program at Bennington College. Raised in Brooklyn, New York, Sabrina Orah Mark is the author of the poetry collection Simsum and The Babies, 2 collections, which is the winner of the Saturnalia Book Prize. Her collection of stories, Wild Milk, won the Georgia Author of the Year Award for short story and was a finalist for the Townsend Prize for fiction. Happily, her collection of essays on fairy tales and motherhood, which began as a monthly column in the Paris Review, recently won a National Jewish Book Award. Mark's accomplishments include a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship and a Sustainable Arts Foundation Award. In addition to teaching private workshops, she currently teaches nonfiction, fiction, and poetry for the Bennington Writing Seminars. She lives in Athens, Georgia with her husband and their 2 sons. It's a pleasure to be with you both, and it's wonderful to see so many in the audience today. So we'll just dive right in. Sabrina, you've written a memoir, you call it a personal history, that feels at times very much like a fairy tale. Writing near the end of your book about your son Noah, who's grappling with math homework, we encounter these lines. Outside, it is mistier than usual. A castle rises in the distance. A light from the tower flickers on once, then twice. A king walks sadly by, dragging his velvet robes. The fog is thick. A boy flies over the trees. And Elizabeth, you've written a novel that at times has the uncanny feel of a memoir. Towards the end of your novel, your first-person narrator, who, like you, is a writer and a teacher, says this: When people said to me, you should write about your parents, I always said, not when they're alive. Not because they were awful, they were wonderful, but because they were odd and extraordinarily private, and I didn't feel I could write about them with any kind of honesty, a necessity, even in, especially in fiction, if I knew they were going to read it. So I wonder if we can start our conversation here with the blurry line between fiction and nonfiction. Sabrina, as you've put it, between the real and the unreal. Where is that line for each of you? And I'll let whoever wants to dive in start.
Do you want to start, Elizabeth?
We're both so polite. We're looking at each
We're
other
like,
on Zoom. It's very
"Well,
hard to
after
fix
you."
people with a I don't know. I feel like I'm always trying to find it as I write, and that there isn't a line. And I was thinking, in Happily, one of the things that I love is that Sabrina will start to describe things as though they are happening, and your logical mind knows that we've entered sort of the fairy tale description of things. And it feels very true to life to me. The fact that the line into unreality or fiction or myth isn't always visible or isn't always a line, and that you drift one way or the other. And I feel like as a writer, I'm really interested in being allowed as much drift. The older and older I get, the more I want to drift, and the less interest I am in, the less interest I have in any sort of straight line, whether it's forward or division.
Yeah, I at the end of the hero in this book, you asked that question about like authorial intrusion, like how, like that you were taught you weren't allowed to do that. Like, God forbid, like the writer show her ego a little bit, or if it starts rubbing through the pages. I love that question, and I love the question in the book, like, at what point was I told I wasn't allowed to do that? I I I think for myself, actually, like, I wanted to write about things happening in my life in a very present way. Like, I really started Happily because I thought, like, how do I move? How do I move through this world? Like, how am I a mother? Like, what the hell am I doing? I don't know what I'm doing. I mean, that was really the like impetus behind writing Happily in the first place. But it was, I couldn't write about the real at all without finding something unreal to hold on to. And so when I found the fairy tale, I was like, aha, like you're coming with me, like, let's go. And so it kind of, the fairy tale world, or like, let's say the fairy tale stepmother, allowed me to understand the real stepmother of myself, or the fairy tale husband allowed me to like write about marriage in a way I don't think I could have been able to otherwise. Like, it gave me this, because I figured no matter what I would do, it wouldn't be nearly as bad as like the things that people do in fairy tales. So
Got
that
it.
helped also. Yeah.
Appreciate those answers as a starting point for this conversation. I would love to bring both of the voices of your work into the conversation if we could, and I'd love to just ask you both if you can read just a short piece from your work so that the audience today can get the sound and the cadence of your work in their ears. Maybe just a minute or two each, and maybe Elizabeth, you could go first.
No, because I don't have a book near my computer.
Oh no.
I can probably, if Sabrina goes first, I can pull something up from my computer to do it. Is that
Sabrina,
all right?
you have-
Sorry, I'm terribly unprofessional
No,
and
that's
unprepared.
okay.
I
So-
can hold, should I hold your book up and you can read it?
That works.
I'll just gesture.
Sabrina, maybe you can start us off.
Okay, let's see. Let me think. All right, I'll read the first 2 pages of the prologue. How about that? Does that sound good? Okay. As a child growing up in Brooklyn, I had a book of fairy tales I never opened because on the cover it had a salivating crocodile in a brown corduroy vest who I imagined would eat me if given the chance. There is no such book, says my mother. You're imagining things. The cover was flecked with gold and its spine smelled faintly like fish. I search for it online. I type in fairy tales, crocodile, brown vest, salivating. I type in 1985. I type in I was afraid. It looks like, says the computer, there aren't many great matches for your search. Try using words that might appear on the page you are looking for. What I couldn't open as a child, I want to open now. I am ready to read all the fairy tales in a book my mother insists never existed. Fairy tales about witches with long knotted tongues, or children baked into bread, or daughters who run so far away from home they grow a second heart. But I can't find the book. Are you certain, asks my husband, it was a crocodile and not an alligator? Are you certain the corduroy vest was brown? But my husband isn't really looking for the book. It's for me to look for and for me to never find. There is a path of pebbles inside that book I will never follow. There is an unlived life that begins 11 pebbles in. I am so far away from where I've never gone and what I'll never know and who I'll never be. It is impossible to tell if on that path I am radiant or falling to pieces. What are you thinking? Asks my husband. Nothing, I say. I pick a crumb from his beard, put it in my mouth, and swallow. Home is so far away from home.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. Appreciate that. Elizabeth, was your mission successful?
Yes, it was. I love
Wonderful.
that prologue so much. I love how vividly I see that crocodile or alligator in salivation. I'm just gonna similarly just read from the very start of my book, and with that weird unfocused look because I'm reading off my screen. This was the summer before the world stopped. We thought it was pretty bad, though in retrospect, there was joy to be found. Above ground monsters were everywhere, with terrible hair and red neckties. The monsters weren't in control of their powers. The hate crimes, mass shootings, heat waves, stupidity, certainty, flash floods, wildfires, they had reach. Everyone always talks about the weather, but nobody does anything about it. Turns out we were supposed to. August 2019. I shouldn't be vague, though. That's my nature. Things felt dire, which now seems laughable. You could still unthinkingly go places. Myself, I'd gone to London, where a heat wave had bent train rails and shut down art exhibitions and turned the English into pink, panting mammals. I, pink, mammalian, panted alongside them. I was trying to decide what I thought about my life. On the internet, I found a small hotel in Clerkenwell, a neighborhood I hadn't heard of. Clerkenwell, the owner of the hotel clarified when I arrived, but I couldn't get the hang of deforming only the one E and kept calling it Clerkenwell. He was a gentle, blinky Englishman named Trevor, who might have been 30 and might have been 50. He had a shaved head, hoops in both ears. He wore espadrilles, long, loose shorts, and a brown linen vest, which he surely called a waistcoat and surely pronounced waistcoat. Altogether, he looked like someone who was either a vegan or knew how to mindfully butcher a pig and use up every bit, snout and kidneys, trotters and tail. Perhaps you fear writing a memoir, reasonably. Invent a single man and call your book a novel. The freedom one fictional man grants you is immeasurable.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Your reading starts where I'd like to pick up on this question that we started with, actually, about the real and the unreal, at least for a bit longer in this conversation. And Sabrina, I want to go to that spot that you identified in Elizabeth's novel. It's a moment that your protagonist, Elizabeth, talks about. She's recalling being in a workshop, a writing workshop in Iowa City, in which she submits a piece on deadline and she labels it a nonfiction short story. And she's immediately accosted by a classmate who says, "What does this even mean? A nonfiction short story? Which is it? Fiction or nonfiction? It matters." And as you say, your character was being accused of committing that great aesthetic crime of the 1980s, authorial intrusion, which Sabrina, you alluded to. Fortunately, the workshop teacher quickly steps in, clears his throat, and settles the matter. "If I know one thing," he says, "it's that it doesn't make any difference. Call it what you want." And as encountering this passage, I sort of was of two minds. There was a part of me that really recoiled at sort of the tone of the workshop comment and the way it sort of feels so silencing. And yet and at the same time, there's something I think really encouraging in the teacher's response, that it's almost like a playful, let's not worry about those boxes too much here when it comes to fiction and nonfiction. Let's tell our stories. And so I'd love to ask each of you, now that you've written these books, does it matter, fiction or nonfiction? Have your answers changed at all? Elizabeth, you've written a novel, and Sabrina, you've written a personal history. How do you think about that question now?
Should I, do you want to, okay, I'll start. So, you know, I very much started as a poet, and I walk into each room first as a poet. So I'm all over the place, like in terms of genre. I went to poetry school to study only poetry, and there were years where all I did was just think in poems. And then, you know, I moved into storytelling, and then I moved into these essays. And so I kind of came to the real very much like through language, right? Like I never quite understood, and I still don't really understand how the world works unless I start with a single word, if that makes any sense, and kind of follow the word to get me to some understanding of reality. So for me, I can't, it's very hard for me to differentiate, you know, the imagination from the worlds we walk through, because one so deeply changes the other all the time. And I think my brain is just, you know, the genres are blurred, like the real and the unreal are blurred. I mean, I think, of course, there's like, you know, there's the dangerous side, of course, of like always blurring the real and the unreal. But I think walking into a story with the intention to like better to empathize and sort of like wear skins that don't belong to you in certain ways, and like hear voices that feel far away. I do feel like that intention can open up like really important kinds of stories. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that answer. And as it happens, we all three went to the Iowa Writers Workshop, which and I got so much out of my experience with there. And the teacher who said that is Frank Conroy, who is the person who wrote sort of one of the first literary memoirs about somebody who was only telling his story, wasn't famous, as his first book. But there is the Iowa model. I don't know whether it's shifted at all, but I think when all three of us were there, was very invested in the separation of poetry from fiction, that you couldn't easily move between those genres. And then nonfiction was not part of the workshop and is still not part of the workshop. They have an amazing MFA in nonfiction at Iowa, but it's not part of the workshop itself. And I think I thought for a long time that I was also not so invested in the difference between poetry and fiction, because I had written poetry very seriously, and frankly didn't get in it, applied in poetry to Iowa and didn't get in, and that sort of made a decision for me. But would have said, oh, there's a difference between fiction and nonfiction, which is one of the reasons why when I put this thing that was entirely factual up in class, I labeled it because it seemed to me that I cared that it was true. And maybe I wanted leeway in the criticism and that I got from my classmates, and that was not the population that I should have been asking any leeway from at all at that particular moment. But I mean, I agree that that real life is tremendously unreal, day to day and decade to decade. And I find myself this is actually has been true my writing life. I'm always bamboozled by the notion of realism in fiction, because often it is simply what's sort of statistically probable. And when I was a student at Iowa, a friend of mine gave me a ride to Des Moines, where all my family, the generation above my mother was, and she met some of my relatives, and she came back and said, you guys all think, to our friends, you guys all think Elizabeth doesn't write realistic fiction, but I have met her family and she writes incredibly realistic fiction. Yeah, it feels that it may be that I think that the line between the real and the unreal is the least helpful or useful division, because it's so arbitrary, and everybody's definition of what's realistic is different, even though people talk about it as though it's scientific, that it's a something chemical that you can almost test.
I love that. I didn't know that that was Frank Conroy, who kind of stepped in and came to the rescue in that moment. I remember interesting, one of the things that Frank said to us as we were graduating was, whatever you write, go out and live, get married, have a partner, have kids, travel, whatever it is for you, go do that thing. And I always thought that was maybe the best writing advice that I ever got. I wanna turn now from this question to another one. In one big way, I think these books share something in common. They're different ways of writing about mothers and families. And I think readers will sort of sense this in the books, the challenge of writing about family, of writing about a mother, maybe even the guilt. Elizabeth, in your novel, your protagonist apologizes to her mother for everything she gets wrong in the story, saying, I meant to fix it. I will fix it. I was so moved by those lines. And Sabrina, you actually write about a dream you had in which your mother is standing at the door crying after a story that you've written about her. And she says, how could you, your own mother? And in this dream, you apologize as well and promise to stop writing forever. And in the fairy tale vein, no sooner do you do that in the dream than you grow wild with silence, which is so beautiful, sprouting mushrooms across your face. And for my part, I can't decide, are these books apologies or are they love letters? And maybe Sabrina, you can start, and then Elizabeth, you can follow.
I will say I'm blessed with a mother with a really good sense of humor. She's really, really funny. She's one of the people in my life that makes me laugh so hard I can't catch my breath. There have been times where like we're sitting next to each other, like we start laughing and it's just like the two of us, like in that like kind of like, the silence laughing with the tears streaming down our face, and we're usually laughing at something that is so terrible it's funny again. So I have that mother. So I'm fortunate in that way. God bless her, she likes being the center of these stories. She's the poetic foil. And I think that in the way that I remember for years I was sending stories out to this one editor, like really hoping she would take these stories. And she would say she'd liked them and to send more, and then I would send more. And then finally she just got really frustrated with me and she said, I just wish these had more ballast, and I thought like, oh, and I was mad and grumbly about it. Like, who needs ballast? Like, what's ballast for anyway? Um, Other than like being able to literally walk down the street. And I think of my mom often in these stories and in being able to tell stories as that kind of ballast, like as the poetic foil, like where, like when the poetry and like the beauty and the metaphor like kind of start running wild, and like she's the one that reaches into it and like pulls it back home. And so, and I've learned in writing her in this way that like I can't really have one without the other. Like she is you know sometimes for better, sometimes for worse, like the ballast, that place where you know kind of like I I I splash the cold water on my face and kind of wake up. Like she reminds me to do that. And I'm actually very grateful for that balance. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. It's
Okay.
beautiful. I mean, I love the metaphor of ballast. It makes so much sense. Elizabeth.
Yeah, I mean, in Happily, I love the mother's voice coming in. I should say, now I'm using the word the mother, but I think in your book it's Sabrina's mother coming in and interrupting, and asking for things to be a little more clear-eyed. And I think whether it's in one of my favorite chapters in Happily is also the one about hurting people's feelings with things that you write. Because I always think, oh, I really care about other people's feelings, and then I'm actually writing and I don't. But I was aware that I couldn't really write about my parents when they were alive, except that back in the old days when Twitter was fun, and full of literary people, I tweeted when my mother was in town. And she would say things and I would say, can I tweet that? And she would say, sure. And I sort of turned her into a character. And some of the things that I tweeted are in the book. Like, my mother insisted for some reason that she invented the mojito. And so whenever I tweeted about her, I would say, my mother, the self-proclaimed inventor of the mojito. And I think what she meant was that she liked mint in her rum. But in a really interesting way, doing that like gave me some training to write about my mother after she had died. And in fact, one of her very beloved employees at one point wrote to me and said, I don't think you should be putting these things that your mother said when she was alive on the internet. And I said, I get permission for every single one, because in fact, my mother like to be at the center of attention too. Um, and I think one of the reasons why I wrote a novel and not something called a memoir is because to write a good memoir about my mother, it wasn't about what I could put in. Calling it a novel actually allowed me to leave stuff out in a way that wouldn't make sense if I was writing something that I said was
Mhm.
nonfiction. And those things were mostly, I certainly put things in the book that my mother would wish that I hadn't written about. And I should also say, even though it's a novel, the mother in the book is my mother,
Mhm.
100%. It is a novel. There's a lot of fictional stuff in it, but my mother resisted fictionalizing. And at the very beginning, I tried, and I thought, why would I write a fictional woman who was less interesting than my mother actually was?
Mm. Yeah, both of your mothers come across as very funny, even sometimes when the subject matter turns serious, which I really loved in these books. Um, I just want to remind folks, and some of you are already doing this, that if you have questions, I'm going to ask just a couple more questions. But if you have questions for either one of our authors, please put them in the Q&A. We've already got a few there. We welcome your questions, and we will have time to get to hopefully as many of them as we can at the end of this conversation. Elizabeth, I'd love to stay with you for just a moment. I don't think I'm giving too much away here. That near the end of your novel, there's an estate sale after your mother passes away. The protagonist, and I will keep calling her the protagonist even now knowing what I know, goes into her childhood home where everything that she once loved is being picked over by would-be buyers, teapots, Bert and Ernie puppets, and so on and so on. The protagonist says, I wasn't watching the dismantling of my parents' house, but a peculiar endorsement of their taste. And then later she encounters somebody, maybe this was just outside, who says to the daughter, somebody told me you're the daughter. And I just have to say, I was overwhelmed with emotion inside. Somebody was Jewish? Yeah, my mother too. I just felt when I was in there, these people loved this house. And I love that so much. And I wanted to ask you, how did that person know it was a Jewish home? And is there a connection between the Jewishness and the love that that person saw?
I think there was, and I think trying to remember whether my parents' ketubah was on the wall. I don't think it was, but there would have been other tchotchkes and signifiers in the house, not um enough for her to ask the question, but to know that the answer would have been yes. Including it's now, as you can tell, I also have something of a problem with objects. And the portrait of my great-grandfather, Louis Sharasevsky, who was the first Orthodox rabbi. He went from Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania to Des Moines, Iowa to Indianapolis, Indiana, and the portrait is in the next room in my house as it was going up the stairs in my parents' house. Yeah, and I think it was, it was clearly a house of people who loved books and loved art. And that sort of sense of maybe an overwhelming love of the world and the people in it that sometimes could get a little claustrophobic. And again, I will point to the wall behind me. Yeah, and it was not a tentative quest, and that scene is absolutely exactly from life, and the woman's dialogue is as word for word as I could remember it. And it wasn't a tentative question that she asked.
Hmm.
It was a we recognize each other question in a way that was very meaningful to me when she asked it.
Love that. Love the moment. We could spend the rest of the conversation. I could be asking about all the things behind you on the shelf, the tchotchkes. But I appreciate that so much. Sabrina, I'd love to go to a moment in your book. I was struck by the way you use fairy tales, and you alluded to this at the start too, to write about the real world, and particularly real world problems, pandemic, a corrupt government, mass shootings that no one seems to be able to do anything about. And at one point, you describe your bones hurt, you're not feeling well. You go to your doctor for blood work and x-rays, and the doctor says, sits you down and concludes, "You're sad." "You're sad," she says. You write. "No," I say, "I'm a Jew. This is how we look." And I laughed, and I laughed, but there's really something to that. You write a lot in the book about you grew up religious, devout even. You talk about the chants you would say as a child to bring the Messiah. And the book is, of course, sprinkled with biblical references and references to Jewish holidays. So I just wondered sort of what those lines, what they mean to you in the book. What is it? Why do Jews look sad? But I mean that in sort of like a broader metaphorical sense, which is maybe how you implied it also.
Why do Jews look sad? That's going to be the title of my next book. So funny, because the other day someone asked me if I was okay. I was just thinking, like I was just kind of lost. I was walking and thinking, and she's like, are you okay? And I was like, no, I'm fine. This is just my face. My whole life people have told me that I look very sad, actually. I think that, there is there's that one, I write about this in Happily, where like as kids in yeshiva, we're all like singing "We Are Leaving Mother Russia" at the top of our lungs, like there was this kind of having no, and which also felt like kind of living and studying Torah all day long, like also felt like living in a kind of fairy tale, like where you're surrounded by like miracles, but like a lot of violence and yearning and hope and wandering and exile, and like those were the stories. Those were our daily stories, and we were very serious about it. Like we all had like these furrowed brows. I think that was also this sense of like always, like when you think about like breaking the glass at a wedding, you need to like make sure that like in the joyous occasion, you say like everything is broken, nothing to see here, right? Because there's always a sense of like something is about to go terribly wrong. I think I've always felt that. I was raised by people who always felt that like we're always sort of like on the edge of something, right? Like we're always we're always on the edge of something. Yeah. And I think that's sort of maybe the sadness and the wandering, but it's also something that I was thinking, my son was just recently bar mitzvahed, and he got his talit, and I was looking at him and I thought like, and it's so serious, you have this like 13-year-old boy, he's reading from ancient text, off of like dried animal skin. He's reading like he's wearing this talit, which is like this, like shawl with these knots, and each knot is representing like another deed he should do, right? So there's like kind of almost like the beauty, but also the heaviness of the knots. And it's like, here you go, like you're 13 years old. Like it's good. There is like a heaviness, but I also find it, endlessly beautiful. And I like was looking over at that tallis he was wearing, and I was thinking it's like this wandering synagogue he can kind of take wherever he goes. So yeah, I'm off top. Am I off topic?
No, so beautiful.
Okay,
So I
yeah.
really appreciate that, and the window into your son's experience. It's another beautiful metaphor, excuse me. Thank you. I'll make this my last question. We have a lot of questions coming into the Q&A, and again, if you do have a question for Sabrina or Elizabeth, please put it in the Q&A. I found both of these books so beautiful, so lyrical. It's hard to pick just one sentence that stands out, but from each book, I jotted down one sentence for this conversation that just really hit me in different ways. Sabrina, in your book, there's a moment when you're on a flight, there's really bad turbulence. Your son is trying to play a word game, and you're gripping the armrests of the seat and just focused on the shuddering plane. And he gets frustrated with you and he says, "Mama, we'll either die or we won't die. Just tell me one word." I thought that's wisdom right there. And Elizabeth, in your book, there was this moment when the protagonist, again, is just wondering what gives her the right to write about her mother. What is it? And in the end, she says, I think I do have the right because I'm only one person. And the quote that I jotted down is, every one person is allowed their own story. So Elizabeth, maybe we could start with you. I just would love your reflections on those lines, or if there's another line that like you'd really love to talk about, I could welcome that as well. But
No, I'm happy to talk about that. And I have to say, it always makes my heart sing when people say, "Here's a sentence I really love in your work," because that may be the thing that I am vainest about as a writer. And that there's a whole passage about being only one person that's from, and I think that's towards the end of it. And it's something I think about a lot about. Um, as a teacher, I think a lot about it. As a writer in the world, I think a lot about it. That both you can't write something that's going to try to appeal to everybody. You can't. I sort of think continually my students who I love, particularly my graduate students, get worried about what they can write and what they're allowed to write, and how their writing will be received. And I always think you can only write as one person. You can only write as the writer that you are. And that actually, and that's what I hope the line, Josh, that you quoted from is about, which is that that's also a powerful statement to say that it should be liberating to think I am one person, and I have the expertise of my own life and my own emotions and my own obsessions and quirks and flaws, and that all of the writing that I'm interested in reading comes from that point of view. You know, there's no other writer who could have written happily. It feels like it is so much the work of this one brilliant artist, and it isn't trying to reach out. Reach out is the wrong word. It's so idiosyncratic. And because it's so idiosyncratic, it's universal. And that's the thing that's what I go to art for, is that something that is so particular that it speaks across, as opposed to the notion of like, oh, we should all be, maybe it's related to that question of hurting people's feelings. We should all be trying to write something that will fit everybody's experience. And the books that fit everybody's experience are the ones that I think or that fit a lot of people's experience, are the ones that are idiosyncratic and come from the single person.
I love that. It feels really liberating, actually, to think about. Sabrina.
I'm thank you. That's just like the kindest. Thank you so much for saying all those incredibly nice things. Elizabeth, I just so you've rendered me speechless. I'm gonna just like blush and crawl under my desk. Um, I forgot the question. Oh, it was the same. Was it should I
Just if
speak
this
to the
in
line?
yeah, or
Okay.
what comes after, or I mean, what yeah, in that moment, just reflect on that line in that
Yeah.
moment.
Um, there's um the way that I do, I think very often, it was actually one of my students who brought me Borges's Aleph, that story, uh Borges's story, the Aleph. So I came to that story like super, super late. It's one of my favorite stories on earth. When she brought it to me, I was like, how have I not been reading this like every day of my life? Like, how have I even been walking the streets without knowing this story? But there's this moment in the middle of the story where um this one character goes down the staircase and he sees this little olive in the back of the staircase. Um, and um, and he looks at this olive, and in looking at the olive, the whole universe sort of appears to him, like everything inside of the universe. But he has to just like look at this tiny, tiny olive, which kind of goes back to this idea of like how the idiosyncratic, or like the very small, the details, like the birthmark, or like the wound, or that like one thing you do differently from everybody else, that one little scratch in the back of the staircase, if you look at it for long enough, like if you stay there in that moment, like that's kind of like where the universe of your voice is. And so I think I do really agree, like by being incredibly like specific and looking at like, the smallness of yourself, um, you kind of see the bigness too, right? It's the way that like there are these, like the nautilus shell, right, reveals like um um the those patterns are like revealed like all throughout nature, um that spiral. And so I do really, um so in that moment where he says, I just want one, just like give me one word, just like one word, like we're either gonna die or we won't die, but just like give me one word. It's I often feel like by looking at that one word, um it ends up being a kind of like portal into like a third possibility, like this new story, um which is what like I feel often like my kids are asking me for, like not one thing or another, but like a space for them to just, you know, be themselves.
Mm, well, thank you. Um, I do want to turn to, we have a lot of great questions, and a number of people are wondering about how you write, about process. Um, we have a question: what is your favorite way to write? Do you set a schedule? Do you write as the spirit moves you? And then Nancy Light asks, can you tell us about your styles, your writing styles? Does your book come out of you, gush out of you all at once in a short period of time, or is it more painstaking, writing daily for a specified time over months or years? Maybe you could both take a crack at that. Maybe Elizabeth, we can start with you since we ended with Sabrina.
Sure. I to mention Frank Conroy again, one of the things he said on my first day of class was real writers write every day. And my entire teaching experience is countering that notion, because I am not somebody who writes every day. And if I try to, it's not just I don't like the advice because there are so many people for whom that's impossible. We're talking about books about motherhood, parenthood, taking care of people who are older than you and younger than you often interferes with that, but also because those things that prevent you from writing every day are the things that can make you a better writer. I do think that there are some people for whom it's advice for those for whom it's good advice, it's great advice. There are people who do need to, and that I think I'm writing a book about writing right now. We'll see if I finish it. But I go on at length about it, so I won't go on at length about it here, other than to say that we are all so different, the people who write, and that the important thing to do is to learn how you write best. And I write really boring stuff if I write every day. And when I teach, I don't get very much writing done. So I'm on break now and I have a leave in the fall and I work really long hours. It comes pouring out of me and then I have to go, oh my God, what a mess just came pouring out of me, and have to try to find the shape in it as I revise. I'm not somebody who labors over language, even though I love language. If I get a sentence wrong the first time, it's a sign that there's something wrong with the sentence, and I try it again. I don't spend a lot of time going, what punctuation should this be? Or is that exactly the right word? I sort of run at it over and over again. It's very, from the outside, it looks quite undisciplined, and I suppose in some ways it is, or at least it's not orderly. And yeah, and it's always, for me, it's always language first. And then I have to look and remember, oh, people like human beings to be in the language. And they like those human beings to do things from time to time.
Mm. Yeah, I love,
Oh,
I was just going to say, please write that book about writing. And I loved the parts of your book where you talk about all the time, or your protagonist talks about all the time she didn't write, like great swaths of time, because that need to recharge and come back to writing, I think, is very important. Sorry, Sabrina, go ahead.
No, I'm very excited about your book on writing. I also want to say I love your brilliant Substack, the Release McCracken. Like I love that. I love it so much. It just gives me so much joy. It's such a brilliant writing project because like it's just, I love how you're just returning to the same space over and over again. And it feels like it's there's such genius around it, around like entering into the same space at around the same time every day, right? And allowing your imagination like to go wild, but only like within the confines of like a certain space and time. It's just, I tell everybody about it. It's so
For
good.
those who don't know, it's entirely a place for me to brag about the fact that I wake up at 5 o'clock and swim at Barton Springs pool here in Austin year round. And it is entirely motivated by braggadocio.
Bragging. Okay. Well, I am very
Thank
impressed. I am very, very impressed. You're like,
I couldn't let a moment pass by where there are a bunch of people listening to me for me not to mention that that's what I do.
Right.
Sorry, Sabrina, go on.
I love that. It's like, I don't know if you heard, but I woke up very early this morning. I will happily came out of a monthly column. So it was a very different writing experience than I had ever had before. I had the most wonderful editor on earth, just this incredible editor, Nadja Spiegelman, who without whom like happily would not have existed. There'd be no happily without Nadja Spiegelman. And she gave me like that space, and she gave me that column, and she had asked me originally if I wanted to do weekly or monthly, and I thought, well, surely I cannot write an essay every week. So I said no to the weekly, and then I said, surely I cannot write an essay every month. Like that's impossible. So I said yes. And then I was filled with like just terror, like absolute terror. And so every month I would start and I would collect these it would usually be like something would happen and I would think like, okay, how am I going to deal with this, and how am I going to use a fairy tale to help me figure out like what just happened. But what I realized actually was that because it was this monthly column, I was writing with the moon. And so it would begin where I would kind of have like just this very like thin piece of light. And then I would, panic, and then I'd call one of my closest friends and say, this is it. Like, this is going to be the month where it's like, there's going to be no moon. Like, it's not going to happen. Like, nothing will happen. And then, um, um, at one point she said to me, you are going to, bring all the women out of, menopause. Because I was just like, um, anyway, so it turns out that that structure, and I think about your Barton Springs also like as that kind of structure where I knew I had the month, like I knew I just had that one little piece of time and I had to get something within that space. And that was really helpful to me because otherwise, like, things get so wildly messy in my head and I can't remember where I began and where I ended. And so that helped a lot. Now I'm working on a new thing and it's a complete mess and I'm trying to teach myself again what I'm doing.
I love that notion of having to learn again. And the moon, of course, is such a beautiful metaphor in your book for what happens when if you ever were to stop writing. You say, Sabrina, that you would be, how do you put it? Do you remember near the end? It's okay.
This is the problem. This is why I have to write everything down because I don't remember
Okay.
anything.
Uh, just
Yeah.
while you're thinking, we have in the chat the link to Elizabeth's Substack. Also, a number of people were asking about the story, The Aleph. That is also in the chat. We have a link to the story if folks are interested. And there's so many more questions I'd love to get to. Evie, I think maybe we need to wrap up, or do we have time for? Probably we need to wrap.
Yeah, kind of, but we have so many questions, and I'll see if I can, I don't know, maybe copy them over, send them over to Sabrina and Elizabeth if they have time and they can offer us some insight. Maybe I can have them answer them. If not, they have already given us so much of their time. So I just want to thank Sabrina and Josh and Elizabeth so much for all the time that from today and for answering all of these questions. We really appreciate you, and we appreciate everyone who came to this incredible event. It was so interesting, and everyone sent so many good questions, and I can't believe we had so many. I want to thank again all the partner organizations of the Global Jewish Literary Alliance for all their help in putting this together, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day and a wonderful summer. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
So thank you
Joy.
so much. It was so wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.